At Thanksgiving dinner, my father laughed and said, "You've always been the family disappointment." So I handed him the bill for every dollar they ever took from me. I hadn't sat at that dining room table in over 4 years, and even as I parked down the street to avoid blocking Trevor's new SUV in the driveway, I already knew this dinner wasn't going to be about reconciliation, it was going to be about records, truth, and finally putting value to the years I'd spent being treated like a piggy bank no one respected. My name's Jenna. I'm 33, single by choice, and for the first time in a long time, financially stable, something that still feels surreal considering that, not too long ago, I was maxing out a credit card to cover my father's back taxes because he couldn't let the IRS embarrass the family. As I walked up the path to my parents' front door, I could already hear the laughter echoing from inside, the kind of forced holiday cheer that people put on like a mask when the truth underneath is too ugly to speak aloud. I held a simple envelope in my coat pocket, manila, thick, and labeled in my neat handwriting, Family Ledger. It felt like walking into a performance I no longer wanted to star in, but I had one final role to play before I bowed out of this absurd production for good. The door creaked open, and there was Mom Carol, with that same tight smile she always used when she wasn't sure if she was happy to see me or scared I'd bring up something unpleasant. She hugged me like someone trying to meet a quota for warmth, then called out, "Frank, Jen is here," as if I were a late delivery and not her daughter she hadn't seen in nearly half a decade. Dad, Frank, was already on his second beer by the look of his red face and the way he clapped me on the back like a co-worker instead of a father. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he said with a smirk that had never once felt affectionate. "Thought you might be too busy being a boss lady to join us regular folks this year." Trevor greeted me with his usual showmanship, pulling me into a one-armed hug while balancing a glass of whiskey in his other hand, still wearing his Bluetooth earpiece like someone was going to call him with $1 million deal during the stuffing. Molly, sweet but spineless, gave me a quick squeeze and a whispered, "I'm glad you came," which might have meant something if she hadn't also been the one to ghost me after I declined to co-sign her third round of student loans. Dinner was already laid out when I walked in. Mom had gone overboard, of course. 2 turkeys, 3 kinds of potatoes, enough cranberry sauce to drown in. But I knew the real feast tonight wouldn't be what we ate, but what would finally be said. We sat. We passed plates. Small talk swirled. Trevor talked about his new flip and shady side like he'd personally rebuilt every brick. Molly mentioned a life coach she was following on TikTok and how she was thinking of starting her own wellness channel. Dad made 3 comments about kids these days and rolled his eyes when I mentioned that I'd been traveling for work. I watched, said little, and waited, just like I used to when they needed me. They used to call me reliable. What they meant was available. I was the one who skipped vacations to send Mom money for her bridge work when Dad said dental wasn't in the budget. I was the one who overnight to check to Trevor when his car got repossessed and he couldn't afford the embarrassment in front of his fiancée. I was the one who wired Molly 12 grand to avoid her defaulting on loans after she dropped out for the second time, money she swore she'd pay back once she figured things out. It was always me because I was the one with the job, the one who didn't have kids, the one who owed the family for everything they gave me growing up. Even though what they gave me was mostly guilt and the belief that love was measured in dollars sacrificed and silence kept. Danielle, my best friend and business partner, used to say, "Why do you keep bailing out people who'd let you drown?" And I never had a good answer. Until I stopped. 3 years ago, I started a small firm with Danielle's help, financial consulting for people trying to clean up after bad credit or messy divorces. I kept my head down, took extra clients, and used every hour of overtime to pay off the debts my own family had put me in. I started tracking every cent, printing out PayPal receipts, Venmo transfers, bank wires, and even handwritten IOUs from Molly that she probably forgot existed. By the end of the second year, I realized I had given my family over $160,000 since turning 23. So tonight, I wasn't just showing up, I was collecting. Halfway through dinner, Dad made a joke about Trevor's golden child status. Trevor shrugged and said, "Well, someone had to be successful." Everyone laughed except me. Mom changed the subject. Molly offered more gravy. Then Dad looked at me with a smirk I'd known since I was a teenager and said, "You've always been the family disappointment, but at least you make decent pie." It was the perfect line. Cruel, performative, and just light enough to be laughed off. Except I didn't laugh. I reached into my coat, pulled out the envelope, and slid it across the table toward him, gently nudging his wine glass out of the way. He blinked. Trevor frowned. Mom looked panicked, like I'd just handed him a subpoena. "It's not a bill," I said calmly. "It's a record. Everything I ever gave. Every time I helped. Every time I covered for someone here." Silence settled like ash on the table. The only sound was the slow creak of Dad pulling the pages out, his brow furrowing as he saw the dates, the amounts, the totals, all organized like one of the invoices I send my corporate clients. Molly whispered, "What is that?" Trevor said, "Are you serious?" And Mom just whispered, "Jenna," like I had broken some sacred vow of family loyalty. But it wasn't betrayal. It was arithmetic. It was proof. I picked up my fork again, cut into my turkey, and waited. Because we weren't done yet. We were just getting started. Dad flipped through the pages slowly, the smirk long gone. His lips pressed so tight they formed a thin white line across his face, like he was trying to hold back something explosive but wasn't quite sure what weapon I'd just handed him. It wasn't rage yet. That would come later. It was disbelief, confusion, and maybe a flicker of something dangerously close to fear, because Frank always thought he was the one holding the cards, and I'd just laid down a hand he didn't know I was even playing. Trevor leaned forward like he was reviewing some kind of investor proposal, eyes darting over the lines, scoffing quietly when he saw his name in bold next to the $10K I gave him after his second DUI and the threat of court fees he claimed would ruin his real estate reputation. He chuckled without humor, turned to me, and said, "So what? You keeping tabs on your own family now? What's the point of this? Shame us into writing checks." Because I gotta be honest, Jenna, this looks real petty. I set down my fork carefully, wiped my mouth with the napkin like I was still trying to play polite hostess, then looked him square in the face and said, "The point is clarity, Trevor. You all spent years acting like I was the ungrateful one, the selfish one, the disappointment who needed reminding of how lucky I was to be part of this family. I just figured if we're going to keep playing that game, we might as well use actual numbers this time." Mom reached across the table to touch my arm, soft and trembling, like I was a wounded animal about to bite. "Honey, no one here thinks you're ungrateful," she said, voice sweetened with that tone she used whenever she tried to convince herself that her silence over the years hadn't been part of the problem. "We just didn't know you felt this way. You should have said something before bringing this into dinner." I pulled my arm back gently, not rudely, but enough to draw the line she never seemed willing to see. "Mom, I've said something dozens of times. Every time I hesitated before sending money, every time I asked when someone was going to pay me back, every time I said no and got treated like I'd just committed treason. You just didn't want to hear it." Dad finally spoke, his voice low and sharp like gravel under pressure. "You're making this into something ugly, Jenna. Family isn't about dollars and cents. It's about sacrifice, loyalty, being there for each other when it matters. That's what we taught you." I laughed, not a joyful sound, but one that cracked at the edges because hearing him use the word sacrifice like a shield was too bitter to swallow. "You didn't teach me sacrifice, Dad. You taught me obligation disguised as affection. You taught me that giving was expected, that help was demanded, and that any resistance meant I was ungrateful. You never once made Trevor repay a dime, but you made sure I felt guilty when I hesitated to co-sign a loan that could have destroyed my credit for Molly." Molly, to her credit, looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Her eyes were glossy, cheeks flushed, and for once she didn't have anything snarky or defensive to say. She reached for her water and drank like it might drown the tension pouring off the table. Dad snorted, threw the papers down like they'd burned his fingers, and said, "So what's the end game here, Jenna? You want reimbursement? A family refund? Or maybe you just wanted to show off how successful you are now, finally got your own place, your own business, and decided to come here and humiliate us because it makes you feel superior." There it was, the pivot I'd expected. The pride wound turned outward, rebranded as resentment. But I was ready. "No, I didn't come here for reimbursement," I said evenly, keeping my voice calm even though my heartbeat was thudding like a war drum in my ears. I came because I'm done pretending. I'm done pretending this is a normal family. I'm done pretending that your abuse was discipline, that Mom's silence was kindness, that Trevor's freeloading was success, or that Molly's helplessness was innocence. I came because I needed to know if saying the truth out loud would change anything. Trevor pushed his chair back, the legs scraping across the floor with a sharp screech that made Mom flinch. "You know what? I don't need this," he muttered, grabbing his glass and heading toward the living room like he had anywhere else to be but here. "You're a bitter little accountant with a calculator and a grudge. Enjoy your revenge, sis." Molly finally whispered, "Jenna, I didn't mean for things to get like this. I didn't realize how much you gave. I should have. I don't know, paid more attention." I nodded, not out of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. "You had plenty of chances, Molly. I love you, but love isn't a free pass anymore." Mom was crying quietly now, dabbing her eyes with a napkin, and for a second I almost reached out, almost softened. But then I remembered the night I called her crying from my car when I couldn't afford rent because I'd just wired Trevor $2,000 to avoid a supposed eviction. She told me to calm down and trust the family would always support me, but never offered help, never even followed up to ask if I was okay. I stood up slowly, reached into my purse, and pulled out a second copy of the ledger, clean, unmarked, in a slim folder with everyone's names highlighted next to their totals. I set it on the table beside the half-carved turkey and said, "Keep it. Frame it if you want. Just don't ever call me ungrateful again." The silence was deeper now, heavier, and I knew there would be no apology, no cathartic breakthrough moment where they saw the years from my side. That wasn't why I came. I came to reclaim something they'd taken without asking: my narrative, my value, my proof that I had always been more than their disappointment. As I walked toward the door, Dad called out, "You think you're better than us now? Because you've got a few spreadsheets and a condo?" I paused, turned back just long enough to meet his eyes, and said, "No, I'm not better. I'm just done pretending you were ever worth more than what you cost me." Then I opened the door and left without looking back. I sat in my car for almost 15 minutes after pulling away from their house, not because I didn't know where to go, but because my hands were still trembling from the weight of finally saying everything I'd rehearsed in my head for years but had never dared to speak aloud. The neighborhood was quiet, perfectly still except for a few leftover leaves rustling against the curb, and even though the engine was running and my headlights were pointed toward the main road, it felt like my body had stalled in some internal crossroads between grief and relief. I hadn't expected applause, and I certainly hadn't expected apologies. But some ridiculous part of me had always clung to the belief that if I just laid it all out, the truth, the numbers, the emotional toll, it would somehow break through the thick fog of denial my family had lived in for decades. Instead, I got the same reaction I always had: minimization, mockery, and a refusal to even consider that maybe I hadn't been the ungrateful one all along. The first text came in before I even hit the freeway ramp. It was from Molly. "Please don't hate me. I didn't understand how much you'd done." I didn't respond. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because understanding wasn't enough anymore. Understanding was easy when you were cornered, embarrassed, or suddenly exposed. Real accountability was different, and I wasn't about to walk back into the same cycle just because someone finally glanced at the scoreboard. I drove straight to Danielle's apartment. She'd offered to be my emergency exit plan before dinner even started. "Just in case they try to flip it on you again," she'd said, and thank God she had, because having somewhere to land after that psychological ambush was the only reason I didn't implode the moment I walked out the door. She greeted me in sweatpants and a tank top, a glass of wine already poured in my favorite mug, the one that said CEO of my own piece, in gold letters across chipped ceramic. I sat on her couch and handed her my phone, still buzzing with more texts. One from Trevor calling me delusional, another from Mom simply saying, "We need to talk." Danielle didn't open any of them. She put the phone face down on the coffee table and said, "Tell me everything, word for word. I want to hear how it went." So I told her about the smirk, the ledger, the silence, the anger, the gaslighting. The total lack of surprise and how none of them seemed interested in taking any responsibility for the ways they drained me emotionally and financially for the better part of a decade. I told her about Trevor storming off like a teenager, about Molly's pathetic whisper of guilt, and about the moment I looked Dad in the eye and called the whole thing what it truly was, a cost I had been made to carry without consent. When I finished, Danielle just nodded, refilled my wine, and said, "You didn't just walk out of a dinner, Jenna. You walked out of a lifetime contract you never signed. You're finally done paying interest on their dysfunction." That line stuck with me, echoing in my head as I lay on her pull-out couch that night staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile how a single meal could change so little and yet so much. It hadn't fixed anything. It hadn't mended any bridges. But it had done something deeper. It had severed the illusion that there was still a relationship worth preserving if it came at the cost of erasing myself. The next morning, I did something I'd avoided for a long time. I opened my financial records again. Not the ledger I'd handed to Frank that was a summary, a curated history, but the real archive, the one I kept for myself, tucked away in cloud storage and cross-verified with bank statements, credit card logs, and handwritten notes from years when I'd been too poor to afford a proper spreadsheet subscription. I reread the line items not with bitterness, but with clinical precision. January 2014, $1,000 to cover Trevor's car payment. March 2015, $2,300 wire to Dad's accountant for tax settlement. July 2017, $450 for Molly's rent. And so on, year after year, a trail of withdrawals that painted a story far more honest than any family photo on the mantle ever could. I wasn't the black sheep. I was the unthanked foundation. The bailout plan. The emergency fund no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone expected would always be there. And the worst part? None of it had ever come with a genuine thank you. Just more expectations, more guilt, more reminders that I was lucky to be part of a family that needed me, even when what they really meant was that I should feel indebted for simply existing. Danielle and I spent the rest of that Sunday cleaning out the last emotional debris. We drafted a formal letter, not legal, but official sounding enough, that laid out my final boundaries. I made it clear that I would no longer provide financial assistance to any member of the family, no matter the urgency, guilt, or emotional blackmail involved. I wasn't asking for repayment. I wasn't holding grudges. But I was done participating in a system that treated my silence as consent and my sacrifices as currency for continued disrespect. We printed copies. We emailed it as a PDF. And then, for good measure, I texted a photo of the first paragraph to the family group chat with the subject line, "No more withdrawals." Uncle Rick called later that night. He didn't say much, just that he was proud of me, that he wished he'd done something similar years ago when Frank pressured him into co-signing a mortgage that nearly cost him his retirement. These people only know how to take, Jenna. But you? You just taught them how to lose. That hit me harder than I expected. Because for the first time, I wasn't the one left holding the damage. The next few days were quiet. No one replied to the PDF. No one called. Not Trevor. Not Molly. Not even Mom. I knew it wouldn't last. They'd regroup eventually, find new angles, new stories to paint me as heartless or unstable. But the silence, however temporary, was still a kind of victory. And then came Thanksgiving Monday, just 4 days after dinner, when I checked the mail and found a thin white envelope addressed in Mom's handwriting. No return address, no greeting inside. Just a single folded sheet of paper, no note, no explanation. It was a check. For $50. Memo line. For everything. I stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or burn the damn thing. Because whether it was a cruel joke or a pitiful peace offering, it told me everything I needed to know. They still didn't get it. But I did. And for once, that was enough. I didn't cash the check, of course. I pinned it to my fridge with a magnet that says, "Know your worth," and left it there like a reminder, not just of how little they valued what I gave, but of how petty they were willing to be once the gravy train dried up. $50. After years of covering rent, tuition, bailouts, and mortgages, that check wasn't a gesture, it was a statement, a provocation, a final attempt to reduce everything I did into something laughable and meaningless. But it didn't work. Not this time. In the weeks that followed, I didn't hear much. Molly texted once to ask if I was okay, and I told her I was more than okay. I was busy, thriving, rebuilding. She left it on read. Trevor stayed silent, probably nursing his ego and telling himself that I was just going through a phase, and that I'd come crawling back once I needed something. But I never needed anything from them. That was the point. They were the ones who needed, took, and never returned. I had built a life in spite of them, not because of them. I poured myself into work. Danielle and I were expanding the business, onboarding new clients, offering group coaching for women trying to recover from financial abuse, something I understood now more clearly than ever. I wasn't just helping strangers untangle their debts anymore. I was helping them find the courage to stop justifying other people's destruction with their own savings and sanity. That's what my family had done to me, blurred the lines between love and leverage until every generous act came with a price tag hidden under the guilt. And it was never enough to give. I had to smile while doing it, too. I had to pretend that being drained was noble, that sacrifice made me worthy of proximity to people who only valued me when I was useful. Then came Christmas. Or rather, the invitation to Christmas, which arrived by group email like nothing had happened. Subject line: Holiday cheer at Carol and Frank's. Message body: Hope to see everyone at 5 p.m. We'll have eggnog, roast beef, and of course, Jenna's favorite, pecan pie. Signed, Mom. Like Thanksgiving had been some kind of awkward blip we could all pretend never happened. Danielle stared at the email with one eyebrow raised and asked, "Is this delusion or manipulation?" And honestly, I couldn't tell the difference anymore. I didn't respond. I didn't go. I didn't feel guilt. And when Christmas night passed without a single follow-up call, I realized something that hit me deeper than any of Dad's insults ever had. They didn't care enough to fight for me. They only cared when I was convenient, when I was profitable, when I could be counted on to smooth the cracks in their dysfunction with another check or another nod of agreement. Without that, I was expendable. So I decided to do something I should have done a long time ago. I contacted my lawyer, the one who helped me set up the LLC for the business, and asked him to draft a formal cease and desist, not because I planned to sue anyone, but because I wanted clear language on file establishing that I would no longer provide financial support to any family member under any circumstance. I sent a notarized copy to my parents' address and another to Trevor, whose name appeared on more line items than anyone else in my ledger. A week later, I received a voicemail from Mom. Her voice was thick with tears, or maybe just the performance of tears, saying, "I don't know what you're trying to do, Jenna, but this is tearing the family apart. Your father can't sleep. Molly's confused. Trevor's angry. I feel like you're trying to punish us for loving you the only way we knew how." I didn't reply, because what she called love was just strategic control, because what she called confusion was actually discomfort from seeing me step out of the role they had built for me, because what she called family was nothing more than a system of unpaid debts and emotional silencing wrapped in holiday dinners and performative forgiveness. Instead, I took a walk that evening. It was cold, the kind of cold that tightens your chest and makes your eyes water before the wind even hits them, but it was beautiful. The streets were quiet, the houses lit up with soft lights, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't known I was missing: peace. Not joy, not celebration, just silence that wasn't hiding anything. A silence that didn't demand anything from me. The next day, Uncle Rick called again. He'd heard about the cease and desist, probably from Trevor or Mom, and I braced myself for a guilt trip, but instead he said, "About damn time, Jenna. I wish I'd had your spine 30 years ago." He told me a story I'd never heard. How Frank had borrowed nearly $25,000 from him after a failed business deal, and then turned around and told the rest of the family Rick had invested in him out of brotherly loyalty. "Your dad's been rewriting the story for years," he said. "You just did what none of us ever had the guts to do: tell the truth in full sentences." I hung up with tears in my eyes, not because I was sad, but because for once, someone saw the full picture. Not the difficult daughter, not the cold-hearted sister, just a woman who had given too much, too often, to people who treated generosity like an obligation and boundaries like betrayal. That night, I made a list. Not a ledger, not a spreadsheet, just a handwritten list on a piece of notebook paper with a pen that kept smudging as I wrote. At the top, I wrote, "Things I owe myself." And underneath, I filled line after line with things I'd put on hold. Vacations I never took, hobbies I gave up to work overtime, Relationships I neglected because I was too busy fixing crises that weren't mine. I owed myself a home that didn't feel like a battlefield. I owed myself weekends without dread. I owed myself joy without debt. So I booked a flight to Portland, Oregon. I'd always wanted to go. I didn't ask anyone. I didn't announce it. I just picked the dates, paid for it with my own money, and packed my bag with more excitement than guilt. And as the plane took off that Friday morning, I looked out the window and smiled. Not because I was running away, but because I was finally going somewhere just for me. Not to rescue anyone, not to apologize, not to pay anyone's dues, just because I could. Portland was gray and damp in that perfect kind of way, the sky hanging low over the buildings like a soft blanket rather than a threat, and I found myself breathing easier almost immediately. Like some invisible pressure I didn't know I was still carrying had lifted the moment I stepped into a place where no one expected anything from me. I walked the streets with no agenda, wandered into bookshops, tasted pastries from carts run by teenagers with nose rings and pink hair, and smiled at strangers without the weight of pretending I was fine when I wasn't. On the second day, I sat on a park bench with a coffee in one hand and my phone in the other, staring at the inbox I had carefully ignored since landing, its unread notifications stacked like bricks. A silent reminder that peace always comes with a choice to protect it. I opened the first message, a long one from Mom, full of half apologies and rewrites of history. She said they never meant to make me feel used, that money had always been tight, that every family has one person who steps up more than the others. As if that explained why they all stepped on me. I didn't respond, not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood that responding would just reopen the contract I had spent the last year closing. Some messages don't need replies, they just need to be acknowledged as evidence. I walked to a bridge that overlooked the river, the wind whipping my coat around my legs, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself feel everything without editing the edges: anger, grief, pride, freedom, and even that small thread of sorrow that comes when you realize you really did have to walk away to survive. Later that night, I lit a candle in my Airbnb, not for anyone else, but for me. No prayers, no rituals, just fire and quiet and a notebook where I wrote down one last thing I owed myself: peace without explanation. And when I returned home 3 days later, I unpacked slowly, hung up my coat, and opened my fridge to grab something for dinner. The check was still pinned there, crooked beneath the magnet, its value unchanged, its meaning now irrelevant. I took it down, folded it once, and tucked it into the back of my journal, not because I wanted to keep it, but because every story deserves a last page, even if it's blank. They haven't contacted me since. I imagine they've come up with a new version of events where I'm the villain again, ungrateful and cold, the sister who lost her way, the daughter who forgot her roots. Let them. I don't owe them the truth anymore. I gave them every opportunity to hear it. And now, I give it to myself, over and over again, every time I say no without guilt, every time I put myself first, every time I laugh without waiting for permission. Some debts never get repaid, but some finally stop growing. And that, I've learned, is its own kind of wealth.